So we're going to continue to implement the inertia protocol. This time we're going to look to add the props dynamically into the index page. So we will jump to the inertia protocol reference, and we've partially implemented the HTML responses in that we can generate a template that has the correct CSS and JS to load React, and also it has the div component that loads our page, except this isn't dynamic and it always renders the index page. What you can see in this data page attribute is actually the page object. So if I just jump to that, we can see what a page object should contain. So it should contain a component, some props, a URL, and the version. The component is just the name of the page you want to load. The props are the props to pass into that component. The URL is the URL of the page that you're requesting, and then this is the current asset version. So anytime you update your client-side app or your Vite app, you're going to want to update the asset version. And as we can see, those fields correspond with what's in this data page attribute. So what we're going to look to do is to make this data page attribute dynamic, so it gets injected just like these JavaScript and CSS files. So we'll start by hopping back to our Inertia middleware file and adding a field to our Inertia info object to track the asset version. And then that's just going to be a string. And we are going to set this in our register inertia adapter. And we're going to make sure that this version is passed in from our middleware config. So here I create a variable called asset version. I pass it into my middleware, which takes that asset version. We pass it into our register inertia adapter, which then takes it and sets it on our inertia info object. And since we're only implementing a limited amount of the protocol, we're not actually going to use this version, but just for completeness, we should have it on the info struct. Next, in our render method, I'm going to look to create this page object so we can pass it into our render data. So we'll start by getting our request and creating a page object. So just to explain what we've created here, we've created a page variable. It has a component. We take the name of the component from the name that's been passed into render. It has props. We've renamed this data argument to props, and this is going to be the props for our component. We take the URL straight out of our request, and then the version is just set from the asset version in our inertia info struct. And if we jump back to the page object definition in the protocol, we can see that we have a component, props, URL, and a version. And here we have a component, props, URL, and a version. Now we're going to turn this page variable into JSON and add it to our render data. So here we use the marshal function of the JSON package to turn this page into JSON. We convert that into a string and then set it as the page object in our render data. Now that we have this page object, we can take it and insert it into our template. I'll just spin up the dev server to give it a test. And we can see the page loads as usual. And we see the data page object is being inserted and generated for us. Next, we're going to inject props into this page object that we put into our template. So if you noticed, our little prop that we had there originally is no longer displaying because nothing is being sent to it. And that's because we don't add any props to this page object. So what we need to do is in our roots, instead of this being empty, we're going to rename it to props, since this is going to be our props variable, and add our example prop to it. I'm going to restart the dev server just to give this a test. And we can see that our prop is being passed through successfully. But there is a subtle bug here with regards to how this data is injected into the template. If I were to change this prop to a different phrase and restart the dev server, you can see that the page doesn't load and it crashes. We can see, looking at the body, that the prop that we put in hasn't been escaped properly. So we can change the type of this attribute so that it gets encoded correctly by Go. So what we're going to do is make sure that our page object in the render data, instead of just being a string, we're going to wrap it in a type. And that type is going to be HTML attribute. And this basically tells Go it doesn't have to escape this object because it's trusted and it's been generated by the server. So I'll restart the dev server and give it a test. And now we can see this is being escaped properly. And if I inspect and see, you can see it's being escaped and injected correctly. We also want to make sure the other bits we've injected into our page template are typed correctly. So the JS files and CSS files. So we're going to change this type to template. Then we'll restart the dev server and give it a test. And that's all working fine.